We've all heard about the power of a mother's spit. There's nothing that a mother's spit can't do. What can the spit of the Son of God accomplish? We're going to see that today in the passage we're about to study. At the end of the video, we'll consider a question as to whether or not there's a contradiction in the reports of Judas' death. Please join us for our study. Thank you for joining me today as we continue studying through Mark. Please open your Bibles to Mark 7, and we'll begin our study in a moment in verse 31. If you were with us last week, you'll remember how that we noted that Jesus left Galilee and went into Gentile territories after the controversy that he experienced with the Pharisees. And then Mark, beginning again with that passage we studied last week in Mark 7 and on into chapter 8, Mark records how that Jesus ministered in these Gentile territories. Last week, Jesus was ministering in Tyre, but we'll notice where he goes from there in our passage today. So let's begin reading then, verse 31 of Mark 7. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of the Decapolis. Now, last week we noted that it was about a 30-mile journey from Capernaum, which was the home base for Jesus during his Galilean ministry, north to the city of Tyre. And then it's another 25 miles north from Tyre to the city of Sidon, which is also on the Mediterranean seacoast. And so after Jesus goes to Sidon, as Mark records, we're told that he goes down to the Sea of Galilee. So it appears that Jesus then journeyed through this region that was ruled by another one of Herod the Great's sons, Herod Philip. Remember, Herod Antipas, a son of Herod the Great, rules Galilee and Perea. But of course, we noted from Mark 6 that Herod Antipas has been searching for Jesus, desiring to see Jesus because he's heard of the miracles Jesus has performed, and he thinks that Jesus is John the Baptist raised from the dead. So, perhaps Jesus is avoiding that territory that has been ruled by Herod Antipas, and also avoiding the territory where the Jewish leaders have stirred up controversy against Jesus, and now he's traveling through this territory ruled by Herod Philip. So he goes down to the Sea of Galilee, and then Mark says that he also goes into the region of the Decapolis. Now, just that term Decapolis means 10 cities. Deca, 10, polis, city. And in fact, if you've got an NIV, there's a footnote on the word Decapolis that says that is 10 cities. And so the Decapolis was this league of free cities, the majority of which lay to the east of the Sea of Galilee and to the east of the Jordan River. Now, this is not Jesus' first time to go into this area, into the Decapolis. If you remember back in chapter 5 of Mark, we noted in the first 20 verses how that Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee and came into the area of Gadara, and there he cast the demons out of a demonized man. And so Jesus has been in the Decapolis before. Now, things didn't go so well when Jesus was in the Decapolis before, because if you remember it, I'll just turn over and read the passage. In Mark chapter 5, and at verse 17, we're told, "Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region." So seemingly they're scared of Jesus because Jesus has cast the demons out of this man. And so the man from whom Jesus cast the demons out, he pleads with Jesus to be able to stay with Jesus, because Jesus obliges the people and gets in the boat to leave the Decapolis. Well, Jesus won't let the man go with him, but Jesus says to the man, Mark 5 verse 19, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And then we're told what happened, verse 20, "So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed." So now Jesus is back in the Decapolis, this place where before they've asked him to leave. But this demonized man, he's told the miracle that Jesus performed on him. Well, notice how the people of the Decapolis respond now to Jesus' presence back in their region. Verse 32 of Mark 7. There, some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on them. So clearly, this demonized man had some success in changing the opinion of the people of the Decapolis toward Jesus. Now, not only do they welcome Jesus' presence, but they recognize Jesus as being able to do something for them that no one else can do. And so when they hear that Jesus is back in the region of the Decapolis, these people who have, perhaps a friend or a family member who is disabled, he's suffering. He's not demonized, but he's a man who is deaf, and he's a man who consequently can hardly talk. They bring him to Jesus, and they beg Jesus to heal him. Now, what's interesting is they specify the technique that they want Jesus to use in healing him. They beg Jesus to place Jesus' hands on this man. Now, Jesus oftentimes healed by laying on of hands, even when it really didn't make sense to lay on hands. For instance, in Mark chapter 1 and verse 41, Jesus comes into contact with a leper. And this leprous man begs Jesus to heal him, and Jesus obliges. But notice how Jesus healed this unclean, leprous man. Mark 1:41, Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Now, you don't touch lepers if you are a Jew living under Moses' law, because touching a leper makes you unclean. But Jesus was so powerful, by touching the leper didn't transfer his uncleanness to Jesus, but Jesus rather transferred his wholeness to the leper. And so Jesus often healed by laying on of hands. And on another occasion, Jesus was begged to heal through that means. In Mark chapter 5, and at verse 23, you remember Jairus came to Jesus, and he pleaded earnestly with him, quote, my little daughter is dying, please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. And so these people bring their deaf and their mute friend to Jesus, and they beg Jesus to heal him by laying on of hands. Verse 33 of Mark 7. After Jesus took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ear, then he spit and touched the man's tongue. Now this is very different than when Jesus was in the Decapolis before. Because remember, when he was in the Decapolis before, after he had healed the demonized man, he told the demonized man to tell everybody what Jesus had done for him. And that's exactly what the man did. But now that the attitude of the inhabitants of the Decapolis have changed, rather than performing the miracle in front of the crowd, the text says that Jesus wanted some privacy. He took the man aside away from the crowd. And then Jesus doesn't heal the man using the technique that the friends have specified. He doesn't heal the man by merely laying hands on the man. But rather, Jesus does something very unusual. First of all, Mark says that Jesus put his fingers into the man's ear. So, puts the fingers into the man's ear. Then it seems like Jesus takes his fingers out. And then Mark says that Jesus spit and touched the man's tongue. So probably Jesus spit on one of his fingers, and then that finger with the spit on it, Jesus touched to the man's tongue. Now, this isn't the only time that Jesus healed by using spit, which, by the way, spit in the Old Testament would make someone unclean. For instance, in Numbers 12, we're told that if a father spit into his daughter's face, she would be unclean. And, of course, there's a context to that. But spit was unclean in the Old Testament, but Jesus sometimes used spit to heal. Again, in Mark 8, Jesus will use spit to heal. Mark 8 and verse 23, he took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes, he put his hands on him, and Jesus asked, do you see anything? And then another account of Jesus healing with spit will be found in John chapter 9, where there is, again, a man who is blind. He was born blind. and Jesus spit on the ground, and using the moisture from his spit on the ground, he mixed that up with dirt and made some mud, and he put that mud on the man's eyes and healed the man of blindness using his spit. All right, so moving on, verse 34 of Mark 7, which, by the way, before we read verse 34, which I could make this comment from verse 34 as easily as I could make it from verse 33, we have to ask the question, why did Jesus not just lay hands on the man? Why did he choose to heal the man using this unusual technique, putting his fingers in his ear and spitting and touching the man's tongue? Well, perhaps Jesus did this to emphasize the fact that the power of the healing was not in the technique, but rather, as we'll see, especially as we look at verse 34, the power of the healing was in the God who empowered Jesus to heal. And so verse 34 says that Jesus looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. So after Jesus, sticks his fingers in the man's ear and spits and touches the man's tongue, Jesus looks up to heaven. He looks up to the Father. This is similar to what Jesus did when he was multiplying the loaves and fish. You remember Mark 6 and verse 41 says, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. And so, looking up to heaven, it seems that Jesus is signifying to those who are watching that the power to heal is in the God who is in heaven. But then, Jesus sighs a deep sigh. Now, this will not be the only time that Mark records Jesus sighing a deep sigh. In Mark 8, and at verse 12, Jesus will sigh a deep sigh. It says, he sighed deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it. So what's the significance of this deep sigh? Well, the term signifies a strong, deep, negative emotion. In fact, Jesus' deep sigh in Mark 8 will be because the Pharisees, after having seen Jesus perform signs, ask him to perform another sign. And so Jesus sighs deeply because of their unbelief. And so, what would be the negative emotion that Jesus would express by sighing deeply on this occasion? Well, perhaps the negative emotion is this. Remember who Jesus is. Jesus is the one who, with the Father's authorization, spoke the universe into existence. And Jesus made this universe a perfect place. But of course, contrary to God's will, sin entered into the universe and sin ruined it. Sin is the source of death, and sin is the source of disease. Sin is the source of blindness, and sin is the source of muteness. And so perhaps Jesus sighs deeply because as the Creator, he sees how sin has broken the universe and has made his creatures, like this man, deaf and mute. And so Jesus issues a command. After having put his fingers in the man's ear and spitting and touching the man's tongue and looking up to heaven, Jesus issues a command. Just like Jesus at creation issued a command, let there be light, now Jesus issues a command, and it is recorded for us first in Aramaic, Ephphatha. Now, of course, we've noted as we've gone through Mark that Mark will oftentimes record Jesus' statements in Aramaic, and then will give the translation because Mark seemingly is writing from Rome. He's writing to a predominantly Gentile audience who don't understand Aramaic. But the fact that Mark will record these statements of Jesus in Aramaic, it seems to indicate that these reports come from an eyewitness account. Now, of course, Mark was not an eyewitness, but tradition says that Mark's source was Peter, and Peter was an eyewitness. And so Peter probably remembered this very well. He remembered Jesus' words, Ephphatha, just like Peter remembered Jesus' words in Mark chapter 5 with Jairus' daughter. Remember, Jesus only allowed Jairus and his wife, Peter, James, and John, to go in with him to this little dead 12-year-old girl. And there, Jesus said, Talitha cum, Aramaic. And then Mark will define it for us, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. And so Jesus says, Ephatha. And what does Ephatha mean? Well, Mark defines it for us, which is be opened. And so Jesus issues a command to this man's ears and to this man's tongue, be opened. Ears start hearing, tongue start speaking. Well, what's the result? Does Jesus' command have any power? It certainly does. Verse 35, at this the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosed, and he began to speak plainly. And so just as Jesus' command in the beginning, let there be light, just as that command was obeyed, so now Jesus' command, be opened, is obeyed by the man's ears and the man's tongue. Verse 36, Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. Now again, this is very different than the last time Jesus was in the Decapolis. The last time Jesus was in the Decapolis, remember, Mark 5 and verse 19, Jesus commanded the man who was healed, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So when the region was filled with unbelief, Jesus said, tell everybody, let them know what Jesus has done. But now that this area is filled with people who believe in Jesus' power, Jesus' command is, don't tell anyone, but it's not effective. The more Jesus tries to emphasize not to tell anyone, the more they talk about it. Now, why would Jesus say not to tell anyone? Well, again, even though he's not in regions that's ruled by the Jews, perhaps it is, again, to quell the interest so as, not to result in controversy in Jesus' crucifixion before the time. Maybe that's the reason. And so people just keep on talking about it. And notice what people say. Verse 37, people were overwhelmed with amazement. Quote, he has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. So whenever the demoniac went around the Decapolis telling how Jesus had delivered him from the legion of demons that were in him, we're told, verse 20, that all the people were amazed. Well, now Mark says it even more forcefully. As people kept on talking contrary to Jesus' prohibition, as they just kept on talking about how Jesus had healed this blind, mute man, people were overwhelmed with amazement. And in their amazement, they say, Jesus has done everything well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. And so probably Mark records this to contrast the faith that this miracle has stirred up in these Gentile people with the unbelief that persisted among the Jews in spite of the fact that Jesus had done so many more miracles among the Jews. The Jews were just unimpressed with Jesus' miracles, or the Jews were hostile at Jesus in spite of his miracles. But Jesus performs one miracle here in the Decapolis, and everybody is just overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. And by the way, Jesus had healed deaf and mute people among the Jews, and the Jewish scriptures describe such miracles as being a sign that God had come into their presence, that the Messianic age was dawning. Consider Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6. Then, I'll read verse 4. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear, your God will come. He will come, and we could just go on reading, but verse 5. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue will shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. So the Jews had these scriptures saying that these were signs of the Messianic age. They saw Jesus performing those signs, and they wouldn't believe in him. These Gentiles don't have those scriptures, but they say Jesus performing these signs, and they say, wow, he has done everything well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. And by the way, Jesus does do everything well. Jesus does everything well in my life, and Jesus does everything well in your life. Jesus can save us from our sins. Jesus can work in our lives providentially to grow us and mature us so that we take on more and more of His image. Everything that He does in our lives, He does well. Our question for today is this. The accounts of Judas' death in Matthew and Luke are different. Do they contradict? Well, that is a frequently asked question. It is true, when you read through Matthew's account of Judas' death and Luke's account of Judas' death found in Acts chapter 1, they appear to be very different. But I think that if we look at them a little more closely and think about them a little bit, we'll see that actually, even though they're different, they're not contradictory. Now, let me read for us first Matthew's account, and then we'll read Luke's account in Acts chapter 1. So Matthew chapter 27, I'll begin reading in verse 3. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this money into the treasury, since it is blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Now, two things I want us to note from that text. The first thing is that Judas threw the money that he had gotten from the Jewish rulers to betray Jesus back at their feet in the temple. And then the Jewish rulers took this money that Judas had returned to them and bought a field as a burial place for strangers with it. Second thing I want us to notice from Matthew's account is that after that, Judas went out and he hanged himself. All right, so keep those two things in mind. Now let's look at Acts chapter 1, and I want us to read verses 18 and 19. Acts 1:18 says this, "With the payment he, that is Judas, received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong, his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, so they called that field in their language Akeldama, that is, field of blood." So in this text, we're told that Judas bought the field, and number two, Judas fell headlong, and when he fell headlong, his body burst open and all his intestines spilled out. So the point is often made, well, there's a contradiction, because in Matthew, Judas returns the money to the chief priests. They buy the field with it, but in Acts, Judas buys the field. And then in Matthew, Judas hangs himself and dies that way. But in Acts, Judas falls headlong and his stomach bursts open and his bowels gush out. So are these things contradictory? Well, I would say no. You can put them together in a way that they harmonize. Keep in mind, one thing that is consistently taught in Scripture is this. What is done through agents, let me rephrase that. What a person does through an agent, that person does himself. For instance, if you put together the healing of the centurion's servant in Matthew and in Luke, you see that Matthew records it as though the centurion goes to Jesus and asks Jesus to heal his servant. But when you look at Luke, you see that actually the centurion sends representatives. But Matthew and Luke aren't contradictory. What the centurion did through representatives, as per Luke's account, Luke chapter 7, the centurion did himself as per Matthew chapter 8. And so it's perfectly reasonable to say that Judas did buy the field. He bought the field because he returned the money to the chief priests, and with Judas' money, they bought the field. So there's a way to see that so that it doesn't contradict. Well, what about Judas' death? Matthew, Judas hangs himself, but in Luke, Judas falls headlong and his stomach bursts open and his bowels gush out. Well, what if the rope broke? And what if Judas were hanged in a rocky area? And so the rope broke after Judas' body had swelled up a little bit, and he hits a rock and his bowels gush out. That certainly is a way to put the two together so that there's no contradiction. Well, sometimes people will reply and say, well, that won't work. Because in Acts 1:18, we're told that Judas fell headlong. And that means that his head fell first. And if Judas were hanged, and after he had been there for a while and his body started to swell, if then the rope broke, he wouldn't fall headlong. Rather, he would fall feet first. And so there's a contradiction. Well, what if, again, Judas hung himself in a rocky place? And maybe there's a slope. And so what if Judas, after hanging himself and the rope breaking, what if he falls and he does start to fall feet first, but then he quickly hits a rock that causes him to fall in a different way, and maybe at that point his body flips and he starts to fall head first? Well, wouldn't that work? Isn't that a way to put it all together so that there's no contradiction? Well, it seems to me that there is. And so I don't believe that Matthew and Acts are contradictory, even though they're different. They're complementary. So, great question. If you've got a question, please submit it to the email address at the bottom of the screen. Thank you for joining us today in our study. If you found this video helpful, please like it. And if you've not yet subscribed to MetaView's YouTube channel, please do that now. I look forward to studying with you next week. God bless you.